It was supposed to be a routine missile test. 40 minutes before the scheduled launch, however, the countdown is initiated and the target coordinates set for the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The captain of the USS Mavis shouts that there is nothing in those coordinates. Unbeknownst to him, however, at that moment the missiles are detonating on the lost city of Atlantis. Shortly thereafter, giant tidal waves crush coastal cities including Gotham City, Metropolis, and Boston, drowning thousands of people. Aquaman reveals to the Justice League that this is part of the Atlantean war plans and that the next phase is to sink the city hit the hardest by the waves. Orm, Aquaman's half-brother and king of Atlantis, along with the armies of Atlantis, rise out of the ocean and lay siege to the city of Boston, threatening to sink it into the ocean. Aquaman, torn between the surface world and Atlantis, tries in vain to convince Orm that the missile strike was an accident and that they should all return to Atlantis. He, along with Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, are captured and sent to the Dark Waters, where they uncover a conspiracy that set the whole course of events into motion.
The question that keeps coming up throughout the storyline, though, is whether or not King Orm and the armies of Atlantis were justified in their attack on Boston. Hello everyone, my name is Jordan, this is Comic Ethos, the show where we take a look at your favorite comic book characters and storylines and find out what makes them tick. From our perspective as readers, the missiles striking Atlantis are clearly not an intentional act of war. But look at it from King Orm's perspective. It's not unreasonable to believe that this was actually an attack from the surface. Aquaman even says in a conversation with Batman that, "You need to understand, Batman, Atlantis' interactions with the surface world have been sailors slaughtering its people, and nuclear tests, and environmental disasters poisoning their oceans. They're an extremely superstitious, protective, and aggressive people as it is. You come at them straight on, and they'll come back 10 times harder." All of that being considered, we have to ask, was the attack on the surface world justified? Can war ever be justified?
Before we can begin to answer those questions, we have to try to define what war is. Cicero called it a contention by force, which is a good start, but doesn't appear to be sufficient. Diderot defined war as a convulsive and violent disease of the body politic, while von Clausewitz took a more neutral tone, calling it the continuation of politics by other means. These are just a handful of hundreds of ideas regarding what war actually is. Some, like Cicero, seem to define war as any forceful struggle, whether it's political, interpersonal, natural, or even non-literal violence. This is called the pervasive universe theory, the theory that war is simply a symptom of a universe constantly undergoing change. Heraclitus exemplifies this idea with the quote, "War is the father of all things." While the pervasive universe theory is certainly worth exploring, we're mostly going to work under the political rationalist view, which restricts the definition of war to explicitly declared war between two or more states. This makes the view distinct from interpersonal violence or metaphysical warfare. Now that we've decided what war even means, we can actually dig into the reasons why it happens. There are a lot of metaphysical arguments regarding the causes of war and the natural state of mankind. Socrates, for example, stated that wars and revolutions and battles are due simply and solely to the body and its desires, effectively making a case that the source of war is mankind's abandonment of reason.
You can hear Socrates' arguments reverberating throughout this story. Aquaman indicates that the Atlanteans are aggressive and will respond with 10 times the force if provoked. The sheer savagery of the attacks on Gotham and Metropolis and Boston, the attitude of kill 'em back, seems to indicate an abandonment of reason. And while I think there's significantly more to this topic than just abandonment of reason, I think there's questions of human nature and biology at play. Socrates' ideas are a good jumping off point that we can start from. So here we are. Explosions in Atlantis trigger a swift and violent response against the surface, and while the attack may be understandable, is it justifiable? What we're going to do today is explore the concept of just war theory. And what just war theory is an attempt to reconcile three ideas. Firstly, that taking a human life is wrong. Secondly, that a state has a duty, a moral obligation, to protect its citizens and its ideals. And that thirdly, when defending innocent life or moral values, sometimes the use of force and violence may be necessary. Another aspect of just war theory is that war is always less good than peace, even if that war is justifiable under just war theory.
Just war theory has two required aspects: jus ad bellum, conditions in which military force is justified, and jus in bello, how to conduct war in an ethical manner. Firstly, we'll look at when force may be justified, and under just war theory, it does seem to be quite rigid. The principles of jus ad bellum are as follows: just cause, right authority, good intention, chance of success, proportionality, and last resort. For the sake of brevity, we'll look at a few of these: just cause, good intention, and last resort, and how they relate to our story. Perhaps most important is the principle of just cause. While this is somewhat ethically complicated as a concept, for our purposes it's actually among the most open and shut. Most people would agree that self-defense is a perfectly reasonable cause for violence, and the explosions at Atlantis were a violation of territory, so far, so good. But from there it takes a hard turn. The principle of good intention is slightly different from just cause, and is quite a bit more nebulous. In short, in order to justifiably engage in war, a nation must be doing so for more than self-interest. That is to say, they must pursue war believing it necessary to secure a better peace than would have existed had the war not occurred. Going back to our story, Orm directly says that he believed his counterattack would be a satisfactory retribution for the weapons fired upon Atlantis. His goal is exclusively vengeance, and therefore cannot be considered to be with good intention at all. Finally, and perhaps most egregiously ignored, is the principle of last resort. Were other, more diplomatic solutions pursued? The very clear answer to that is no. We see the explosions strike Atlantis, and then only a few pages later, tidal waves are flooding coastal cities. And that brings us to the second aspect of just war theory, jus in bello: how to remain just during war. And it's important to note one thing about these two aspects. While they may overlap in some areas, they're also wholly separate. That is to say, a nation may go to war justly, but its conduct during the war may be unjust. Or a nation may undertake an unjust war, but conduct themselves ethically during the war. So far, Orm is launching what looks to be an unjust war, but perhaps he deals more fairly within the confines of battle. The two principles of jus in bello are those of discrimination, which is the distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, and proportionality, which is using the minimum amount of force necessary to prevent the enemy's success. Much of the question of discrimination is focused on examining why the killing of non-combatant citizens is immoral, while killing enemy combatants is morally acceptable. One popular analogy is that of a boxing ring. Two fighters entering a boxing ring knowingly make the decision to engage in combat with each other. That said, if a fighter attacks a person, even another fighter outside of the ring, it's unethical and it's considered assault. Much of the dialogue on the doctrine of discrimination revolves more around why violence against combatants is morally acceptable, rather than why violence against civilians is not. It's generally accepted that the non-discriminatory killing of civilians is ethically unacceptable, to the point of being a war crime. It's important to look at the Atlantean war plans here. The plan is to launch a devastating attack on surface cities before sinking one of them into the ocean. We see the attacks take place in Gotham, Metropolis, and Boston. And from what we know in the comics, Gotham and Metropolis aren't military cities aside from a couple of naval shipyards, and Boston in real life has no true military presence either. All of that is to say that the attack was not only non-discriminatory, but it seems to intentionally be targeting civilians. This brings us to the next principle, which is that of proportionality. Aquaman informs the Justice League that the plan is to launch tidal waves at coastal cities and then wait to see which one is the most damaged before invading. We see a giant wave towering over part of the Metropolis skyline, launching an aircraft carrier into city streets. A Nimitz-class aircraft carrier towers 20 stories over the waterline. And if we're just eyeballing it, it looks like the wave is at least twice the height of the ship, so estimating conservatively, we're looking at approximately a 300-foot wave pushing through Metropolis and presumably Gotham and Boston as well. In 2004, a magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck beneath the Indian Ocean and caused waves up to 100 feet high, killing over 200,000 people. In October 2018, a significantly smaller tsunami at 18 feet still killed more than 1,300 people. I only bring up these terrible tragedies to put things in perspective. A wave that size, even on a fortified American city, would be beyond catastrophic and would likely generate casualties comparable to nuclear weapons. And I think it's clear would go far beyond what would be ethically proportional. And that's only the first phase of the Atlantean war plans.
I think it's clear that the Atlantean war plans are wholly in violation of jus in bello, and given that the attack on the surface failed in 2 of the 3 tests we put it up against in regards to jus ad bellum, Under the generally accepted doctrine of just war theory, it becomes clear that, as Wonder Woman pointed out in the story, King Orm is guilty of murder and some very serious war crimes. The philosophy of war is vast, and we've only touched on a very small portion of it. And even within this portion, this doctrine of just war theory, there's still a lot of debate. There are some who don't believe we need to worry about just war theory. Some because, as the saying goes, all's fair in love and war, and others because war can never be justified to them. And moreover, if a war is unjust, who do we hold responsible for it? Do we hold the leaders responsible, or do we also hold the people that those leaders represent responsible? But what do you think? Should Orm be convicted of murder, or is he simply a sovereign ruler protecting his people? And what about Aquaman? He acknowledges that he wrote the Atlantean war plans. Is that enough for him to be tried for war crimes? And what about the Atlantean soldiers? According to the International Criminal Court, a soldier can be held responsible and accountable for actions that he performs while following orders if those orders were manifestly unlawful. Actions like genocide or crimes against humanity. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I've left links in the description box below to sites with more information and more resources on this and hundreds of other philosophical concepts that I hope you find as useful as I have. Until next time, this is Comic Ethos, my name is Jordan, signing off, and as always, read comics and get smarter.